Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we are adding Iceland to our 40, that is. And we've got a 41st nation, Brazil, coming up in April. And we are looking at Iceland's role in the war, the relationships between the Canadian troops and the locals, and various changes that occurred over the years. So that's it. Without further ado, I'll welcome Karen Lilja in. Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. Calling from Kingston, Ontario. Yeah, I'm a cultural historian. I'm Icelandic. I'm doing a PhD in history.
Brilliant stuff. And the fact you're looking at the impact of these different groups of people sort of thrust together in a country that is certainly not unfamiliar in terms of temperatures and snow and stuff to some of the Canadians, but certainly unfamiliar in terms of cultures and things like that. So it's not, you talk about the military presence there, but you talk about the kind of the long-lasting relationships. And I think that's something we were just talking before going live, folks, that I'm intrigued at, because when an armies pass through a place, whether they are aggressive or whether they are allies, they will always leave that kind of cultural impact here. And living in France, the elderly French people don't know, they remember Hershey bars and Wrigley's chewing gum and things like that from the passing of the GIs. Or if they were in the British sector, they remember tea. So it's different recollections there. But I'll bring up your PowerPoint. So folks, feel free to fire away with questions if you have any. But I'm going to hand over to our guest to take us through this. So Canada and Iceland in the Second World War.
Yeah, just thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for having me. Firstly, I checked out your channel and just can't believe that I've never watched it before, because I watch a lot of World War II content on YouTube, and it's just exactly something that I would interact with. So I will definitely be watching some of your previous episodes. But yeah, I guess I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of History at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'm from Iceland, but I'm studying in Canada as an international student. I've lived here for about 5.5 years.
Brilliant. Moving on. Oh. Lost your mic audio for some reason. What happened there? I've lost your audio for some reason. Don't know what happened. I don't know what happened there at all. So I can't hear anything at all. Edit mic settings. Maybe try dropping out and coming in again. That sometimes cures it. Sorry about this, folks. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Suddenly lost you. I love it when these things happen. It was all fine when we were having our chat, but hopefully she'll come back in and it'll come back there. There. Can you hear me, folks? Yeah, we'll see. Anyway, yes. She'll be back, I'm sure. These things I'll try to hit center twice. Good, you can hear me, good. As always, folks, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Check out my guests' books in this case, and or their work in this case. There's some stuff online, and hopefully Karen will be back in a second, and then we can carry on. I don't know what happened there. There we are. She's back.
And I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. Way.
Thank you. Okay, let's pick off. Where did it trail off? I guess
we just said that who you were, the introduction. That's all.
All right. So I guess the topic of my dissertation is the social and cultural aspect of the Canadian part in the Allied occupation of Iceland in the Second World War. And since, Iceland has not been extensively covered on this channel, I might just start with a quick recap of the occupation. So the British forces occupied Iceland on May 10th, 1940, and it was very hastily planned. So the British forces were very ill prepared for the task, and they just arrived for the Icelanders. They arrived very suddenly, just one morning. It was either, I think it was 4, 5, or 6 in the morning, and around the city center, the local people could hear like military airplanes like flying actually way too like low. So they woke up and they heard something, and they knew that there was something going on. So Iceland had declared neutrality in the war, so they were looking to not be part of any of the conflict. But that day, when the British forces arrived, the Icelanders couldn't really do anything because we don't have and we've never had a military. Yeah, and so when the British forces that arrived and the ships and things, the police just kind of helped them aboard or like helped him dock at the harbor and things, and people were still quite displeased. There was a lot of there was a big crowd and things, but at the end they just helped them dock and were quite welcoming. But that day, the British forces secured the island. They met with government officials, and at some point over the next few weeks, the British realized that their men were needed elsewhere. And later that summer, they requested that Canada would take over as the main occupying force in Iceland, which the Canadians didn't want ultimately. But the Canadians reluctantly agreed to send a partial battalion, which arrived later that summer. But the Canadians only ended up staying there for a short period, or until the bulk of the Canadian forces, or no, I mean the British forces left, and the US forces took their place as the main occupational forces in Iceland in the summer of 1941, officially. So in my dissertation, I'm researching the social and cultural aspects of the Canadian part in the Allied occupation. So that means I'm asking questions like, what was life like for Canadians to be stationed in Iceland during the war? And what were their interactions with Icelanders like? And what did they do in their free time, for example? But the next question is, I guess, why would the British forces want to occupy Iceland? Well, firstly, Iceland's location in the North Atlantic Ocean was greatly important to the Battle of the Atlantic because Iceland sits along all the main convoy routes between Britain and North America, which meant that every time goods were transported between the US or Canada or to Britain or mainland Europe, ships almost always sailed through or very close to Icelandic territorial waters. And thus, if the Germans were to capture Iceland before the British got a chance to, the Germans would have severed the lifeline between Europe and North America, causing Britain to possibly be surrounded by Germans on all fronts in 1940, since the Germans had just captured Norway, Denmark, and were steamrolling their way to France as well.
We had the question from Trevor, and it's worth addressing at the beginning. What was Iceland's legal status? Because we get it when we're discussing United Kingdom versus Great Britain or England versus sovereign territories, things like that. Terminology is important. So Iceland, prior to World War II, its status was what?
Yeah, so this is something I get into a little bit later when I'm talking about what Iceland was like in just during that time. And so at this time, Iceland was it was a free sovereign state, but it was still under the Danish monarchy. So it had become a sovereign state in 1918. And after that, Iceland mostly controlled all of its domestic affairs and most of its foreign affairs as well. And it had adopted this policy, or the Icelandic government had adopted this policy around 1918, that they didn't want to be part of any military conflicts or military operations or anything like that. They just wanted to remain neutral. And at that point, that was kind of stripped away from them. That decision was quite taken away. So
Brilliant.
Yeah, but British worries about a possible German occupation of Iceland were not unfounded, however, as there was significant German influence in Iceland in the 1930s. Germans were greatly interested in Icelandic history and heritage, and even connected that with their own ideas about the origins of the Aryan race. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and leading Nazi party member, is said to have been very interested in Vikings, and the Nazis supposedly connected Iceland with those ideas, believing it to be a place of racial purity because it had been relatively isolated for hundreds of years, which was all nonsense, of course, though, apart from the isolation. But in 1939, a new German consul was appointed in Iceland. His name was Werner Gerlach, and he was a brigade Führer, SS, and a known member of the Nazi Party, and was known to be very friendly with Heinrich Himmler. And on the side of the slide, the photo you can see, the photo is signed. It's a photograph of Himmler that is signed and addressed to Gerlach. And I don't remember exactly what it says because it's quite unclear, but it says something like, I looked at it years ago. It was like, to my dear friend Gerlach, or something like that. So it is implied that they were quite close in this photograph exists at the Icelandic National Museum. But Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun, also visited Iceland in 1939. For what reason? We have no idea, really. But she was traveling around the country with her mother and her sister. And there's even like a video on YouTube, like a compilation video of Eva Braun's travels around Iceland, where you can see that she traveled to Vestmannaeyjar, or the Westman Islands, and Reykjavik city center as well, because the buildings in the video are just very recognizable. So that is interesting. Yeah, here you can see Winston Churchill visiting Iceland in August 1941. This quote is from his diaries, and it really manages to convey how relevant Iceland was in the Second World War. Unlike in the First World War, where Iceland remained completely outside of the fighting and out of reach, and it was mostly affected in economic ways. But in the Second World War, the fighting was quite kind of brought to the Icelanders, yanking them into modern foreign affairs, and at the same time out of poverty and isolation from the rest of the world.
I know you're going to be coming on to the life in Iceland on the next slide and beyond, but I've been talking for years about doing a series of shows about neutral countries in World War II, because neutral is a very loose word for a huge array of stances that countries had about the various players in World War II, from Sweden and Spain to Iceland to these other kind of Turkey, other countries that are in some, Ireland, more neutral than others. So was there a sort of as war clouds start gathering, and the 1930s, Nazism takes hold and fascism in Italy, was Iceland sort of watching the world with a this will never affect us kind of way, or was it kind of keenly aware that a global conflict could come their way?
I think they definitely expected. It was obvious that there was some type of unrest brewing, definitely, but there was like I mentioned, there was considerable German influence in Iceland, like even through just like through art, like for example, my great granddad was a national, he was a painter, and he painted like romanticized Icelandic landscapes. And for example, he became quite popular in Germany around that time because he was painting such like romantic kind of romanticized landscapes of Icelandic nature and stuff like that. So there is definitely some form of interaction, and I think Iceland is really like affected by everything that's happening in Europe, but it's always a little bit behind. I find like things arrive a little bit later with like a that time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I guess before we get into the Canadian occupation, I want to like set the scene of what Iceland, and Reykjavik in particular, was like in the 1930s and 1940s. And by European standards in the 1930s, Iceland was considered one of the poorest countries in Europe. Iceland was still dealing with the aftermath of the Depression of 1929. Dirt roads paved most of Reykjavik. Indoor washrooms and bathtubs were considered luxury. And there was extreme food, clothing, and housing shortage. And in fact, many travelers in the early 20th century
to many travelers, Reykjavik didn't really seem like much of a city at all compared to cities on the European mainland, with Reykjavik only having the population of about 38,000 people before the occupation began. But Iceland, like we touched upon earlier, Iceland was under the Danish monarchy in 1940, but they had become a sovereign state in 1918. And that means that the Icelandic government controlled all its domestic affairs and most of its foreign affairs in 1940. When Iceland became a sovereign state in 1918, the Icelandic government declared what they called ævarandi hlutleysi, or everlasting neutrality, meaning that they created this policy of never, not wishing to partake in any future military operations or alliances. And with the sudden arrival of the British forces in May 1940, however, Icelanders were forced to abandon this policy. Some Icelanders saw this as a foreign war and an army just being thrust upon them, changing their society and livelihoods, which is ultimately what happened. As a direct result of the occupation, there was a significant boom in Icelandic economic growth, infrastructure, and urbanization as well. Most of Iceland's population had been more spread throughout the country, but with the occupation and more jobs becoming available in the city center, a lot of people gathered in the city, which created a lot more, even more housing shortage than there was already. But yeah, so within
Brilliant.
this bound of go ahead.
I was going to say the fact that roads came is something we talked about with Holly when we did the show about Alaska a year or so ago. That arrival of people can improve infrastructure or drain resources. Again, it depends on the occupation, depends on the occupier, depends on who arrives, but tends to always affect the situation in one way or other. So yeah, back to you.
Yeah. But within the span of like a few years, Iceland went from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to being one of the wealthiest countries on the continent. And that's why it's so fascinating to look at the societal changes that happened during this crucial period, which is the war years. And despite that, many Icelanders were quite unhappy about no longer being neutral in the war and felt that since gaining sovereignty in 1918, their freedom just had been stripped away and their decision had been taken for them, which people were quite unhappy about. But one particular social issue that is always associated with the history of Iceland during the Second World War is what we call ástandið, or the situation, which was a common phrase used to describe the rising numbers of romantic relationships between Icelandic women and Allied soldiers. And many Icelanders began to see this as a considerable problem, particularly Icelandic nationalists and the older generation. It was often addressed in newspapers, and at one point it was even termed a national crisis. And the way that Icelandic women were treated regarding the situation was found to be very problematic, even to this day, as it was a way for the Icelandic government and police to maintain social control over women. It was not considered socially acceptable for Icelandic women to choose foreign soldiers as their partners. Interestingly, the standards were not the same for men, for Icelandic men, as it was quite common for Icelandic men to work and interact with the occupying forces and make friends with them. So this treatment of women was, at least in my opinion, purely for nationalistic reasons and to maintain control.
Thank you. We had the question about what was Iceland's economy at the time? Was it based mostly on fishing? Scott is asking.
Yes, I would say so. I'm not too familiar with the economic side, but I think Iceland's main export at that time is just fish.
Yeah.
And I think later it becomes like wool, but I think it's just mostly fish at this point.
Yeah, fish and whaling, I guess. Yeah. So the Canadians.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I'm still on the slide before that.
Sorry, I'm moving things on too fast. Sorry.
Sorry, no worries. So the government, just one more point on this one, because this is so fascinating. The government sent up a specific task force within the Icelandic police to track and sometimes prosecute in juvenile courts the Icelandic women who were seen interacting with soldiers. And some young women that were prosecuted were sent to a workhouse called Kleppjárnsreykir against their will. And sometimes even against the will of their parents as well. Their ages ranged from about 11 to 18 years of age. And the history of this workhouse is still very problematic today, and the women who were housed there have not yet received any compensation or apology from the Icelandic state, and this is still ongoing today.
Wow.
Next slide. Yeah, that's fascinating. There was actually a book released recently on this, and it's in Icelandic. It's called, in English, it's called Kynlegt stríð, ástandið í nýju ljósi, or just a gendered war, the situation in new light. And it's fascinating. I think she's an anthropologist rather than a historian. This book is fascinating, and it's just, yeah, it's since these documents were made, so these archival documents were made public recently, and that's why they're able to publish more on this, because it used to be closed documents.
Thank you.
So now we arrive to the Canadians. The Canadians were persuaded by the British to aid in the occupation of Iceland. They were not very happy about that. I guess the Canadians, the ones that participated, enlisted, and they wanted to fight for Canada. They wanted to, I guess the point is, they wanted to see something else than Iceland. Iceland wasn't very exciting. There were two phases in Canada's part in the occupation of Iceland. Firstly, there was Z Force, which was an army battalion made up from parts of 3 different Canadian battalions. And most of the men in Z Force were stationed in Iceland from July to October 1940. But some personnel stayed on with the British forces until April of 1941. And secondly, there was 162 Squadron, which was a squadron from within the Royal Canadian Air Force that was stationed in Iceland from January 1944 to the end of the war in 1945 and a little bit after. So what I'm doing in my research is I'm comparing these two phases of the occupation and trying to see how the interactions with local Icelanders evolved from 1940 to 1945. Only in the last 10 years have historians become more aware of this missing piece in the narrative of the occupation of Iceland, which is Canada's involvement. So there are very few existing secondary sources on this at this point. So that's something we're trying to fix. Next slide, please. Yeah. The British decided very hastily to occupy Iceland on May 10th, 1940. And after some debate, the Canadians agreed to send additional forces to aid in garrisoning the island and protecting it against German invasion. The Canadians in Z Force, just like the British forces, were ill-prepared and poorly trained for the occupation. The 3 partial battalions that Z Force was made up of were the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, and Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal. And there were only about 2,500 men in total in Z Force, which maybe explains why the Canadians flew so far under the radar when it comes to the overall historical narrative of the occupation of Iceland. But many soldiers in Z Force were rather bitter about being stationed in Iceland during the war. So instead of fighting the Germans, which was what they enlisted for, most of them, which is what they were expecting, they were sent to just a small island in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean where there was nothing for them to do except garrison duty and construction work. And on top of that, the weather was really bad. But moreover, the conditions of the Canadian soldiers in Iceland in 1940 were not ideal. Most of the soldiers slept in tents for most of their time in Iceland, which you can imagine, if you've ever been there, sounds absolutely horrible. And the tents at that time didn't have any bottoms. So you would yeah, you would probably get some wind up in there as well. But they did not get any raincoats until the fall, which I found astounding. And they arrived in June and July, like over.
Army units being unprepared for a particular climate. We've never heard that one on World War II TV before, he said in an ironic way. British in Burma, British in North Africa, Canadians in, Hong Kong. It's,
I can imagine that Alaska would have been quite quite unpleasant in this way as well if they were unprepared. But yeah, they didn't get any raincoats until the fall, but it rained most of the days that Z Force was stationed in Iceland. So you can see it in their like their flight logs and their war diary. I mean, flight logs is for 162 Squadron. But yeah, in their war diary, it says like it was rainy and windy, and the next day it's also rainy. Yeah. Again, if you're from the UK, it's maybe not too far off, but yeah, this just means
it's the standard. One of the things it's come up several times on this channel is that a friend of mine did some research into grumbling, things that the British soldier grumbled about. I know we're talking about Canadians here, and going back 200 years, the two primary things the British have always grumbled about are their footwear and the food. And if your boots let in the water, which I can imagine will be the situation in Canada, your tent's letting in the water, and your feet are wet, your morale drops, your everything drops. If you're cold, if you're wet, if you're going to bed wet, getting up wet, no matter where you are, no matter the motivation for enlisting into the army to fight, against fascism, you're just grumpy. And I can only imagine if I was a Canadian sitting on some boat somewhere and someone says, oh, by the way, when we get there, we're going to be staying in tents. It'd have been, oh, really? I mean,
yeah, great.
Yeah, crazy.
The whole summer. But means that the soldiers were not equipped. Meanwhile, the officers, I'm sorry, I'm still on the one before.
Sorry, that's my fault.
Meanwhile, the officers, even though the soldiers stayed in tents, which you can see would have been maybe a tent quite similar in that picture, but the soldiers stayed in tents like that, but the officers had lodgings at Hotel Borg, which is one of the best hotels in Reykjavik. It's still operative today. So there was a huge difference in the quality of life between the officers and the soldiers, like staying at the best hotel in town versus staying in tents. Eating British rations, war rations, versus like eating food at the restaurant at the fancy hotel. So yeah, they were not very happy.
No one likes a divide between the classes and the ranks. It's again, when you're cold, that just makes the situation worse. If you see someone else getting it better than you, never good. But there are women, which is the next few slides are on that subject. So over to you.
Yeah, so in context with what I mentioned earlier, Ástandið, or the situation, it's just very interesting to put the Canadians into that context of like what is happening like in general Icelandic society, and like with the attitude towards the occupation that really affects these kind of interactions. So sexually transmitted infections were also very common within Z Force, unsurprisingly, perhaps. But sometimes they were up to 20% of all recorded illnesses within Z Force, which is considered to be quite a lot. This tells us that there was definitely some interaction between the soldiers and Icelanders, and particularly women, but also men. And that the soldiers most likely did not have any access to contraceptives, such as the condom, which would become more accessible over the following years. The men in Z Force mostly interacted with Icelanders outside their military camp, again, stationed in tents, most of them, not very accommodating, welcoming. And locals were not allowed within that military camp. Z Force's military camp. So the officers enforced this policy quite strictly. So the soldiers of Z Force met Icelanders, and particularly women, at bars and restaurants and guest houses around town. They would go somewhere else to meet them and interact with Icelanders because their lodgings were just not up to par. Next slide, please. In 1941, the United States took over as the main occupying force in Iceland, allowing the British to send the bulk of their men back to Europe. In 1962, no, sorry, goodness, I mean, 162 Squadron numbered only around 500 men in total, but it was nonetheless one of the most successful squadrons based in Iceland during the war. Now, 162 Squadron was sent to Iceland in 1944 because the US forces had moved some of their squadrons from Iceland to be stationed elsewhere in Europe. So an extra squadron was needed for anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. And 162 Squadron was the only Canadian squadron numbered in the 100s that was based overseas during the war. Overseas squadrons usually numbered 200 or 300 and something, but what made 162 Squadron so successful is they managed to sink, I think it was up to 4 or 5 U-boats, mostly on their own. And one of them received the Victoria Cross for the feat, the most prestigious decoration in the British decoration system.
And that's just reminding us that, of course, as you mentioned, the Battle of the Atlantic, the Royal Navy are using it, the shores off there for assembling convoys, and this is part of that combined offensive against the U-boat threat. So it's by air, by sea, it's ASDIC, it's radar, it's naval intelligence, and it's, of course, of aircraft. And so reminding us that it's important. And a couple of viewers have recognized the name from their knowledge of the Canadian Air Force. So good stuff there. But on we move on, Camp Maple Leaf.
Yeah. The officers, this is Camp Maple Leaf, by the way. This is what it looked like. The officers of 162 Squadron felt, actually, this might be an American camp that looks very similar. The officers of 162 Squadron felt that the sole Canadian military camp in Iceland at that time deserved a more fitting name than the one that was called, was it an American camp originally? I think they called it Camp Quit Your Belly Aching. I don't know where that name came from, but they think it deserved a more fitting name, so they renamed the camp Camp Maple Leaf. And the Canadians fixed it up and built both big and small barracks, or Nissen huts, they were called, for social occasions. And so, there were a bunch of these like military camps all over Iceland, and the American ones looked quite similar to the Canadian one, but they fixed it up and added some interesting things. 162 Squadron surprisingly had a very active social life in Iceland. Movies were shown at the camp theater. They had a camp theater. Not all camps had that, but in the camp theater up to 4 times a week, different films almost every time. And furthermore, 162 Squadron hosted approximately 3 parties a week at their camp. And they sometimes hosted big parties where hundreds of people were invited, Icelanders included, like a Halloween party. They had a New Year's Eve party, lavish dinner parties and dances and more. And they, interestingly, almost always invited Icelandic women to those parties, or stúlkas, as they called them, which is just like a word for a young woman in Icelandic. But what is thought to be unusual is that the Canadians also invited Icelandic men to their parties, which other occupying forces did not do as frequently. But watching movies was not the only entertainment for Canadian airmen in Iceland. As mentioned, in connection with Z-Force, many Canadian soldiers were bored with being sent to Iceland. There was nothing for them to do, really. So the Canadian military took specific measures to entertain their soldiers and maintain good morale. But both Z-Force and 162 Squadron played football with Icelandic teams. They competed in boxing and played hockey on the pond when it was frozen and in the city center. They bathed in the Icelandic swimming pools and they practiced equestrian sports as well. But concerts were also held where Icelandic or foreign bands were brought into play for the airmen. But what the soldiers and airmen most sought after when it came to entertainment was dancing, drinking alcohol, and meeting Icelandic women, or stúlkas. Unlike the Z-Force soldiers, who mostly met Icelandic women in town because it was forbidden for the locals to go inside the Z-Force camp, interestingly, 162 Squadron airmen mostly met Icelandic women at organized parties at Camp Maple Leaf, so quite different. During the time that Z-Force was in Iceland, organized entertainment for soldiers was perhaps once or twice a month. And during the time of 162 Squadron, organized entertainment for soldiers was up to 3 times a week if movie screenings are not included. So there's a huge different approach there. Maybe, yeah, I don't know if the Canadian military noticed that the men of Z-Force were extremely unhappy, and then they like, ooh, I guess we changed it.
I wonder, was there a difference in attitude from the Icelandic people to the flyers of 162 Squadron, because they can see that they are actually active in the war effort? There are aircraft flying in and out. There are missions taking place. They're proactive. Whereas the Z-Force guys, yes, there's some construction, there's some work, but they're basically kind of they're not even really in defense as such. They're sort of an occupation force. So was there a different sort of extra respect for the fact that the squadron are seeming to be doing something against the Nazis, or was the attitude to the same to the army and the Canadian Air Force?
I think it was quite different, but possibly for different reasons. Like the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, has a lot more funding, and during that time had a lot more funding as well. So Z-Force were ill-equipped, kind of ratty-looking soldiers versus you have the Air Force men that are upstanding.
Better uniforms, better hats,
nice uniforms.
Better pay. Yeah.
They have these fancy parties as well, where they have all these kinds of things that Icelanders would not necessarily easily be accessible for Icelanders during those war years. So there was definitely a different attitude between Z-Force and 162, but I think it was maybe also just visual differences, perhaps. But we will get more into that as well.
Yeah, and then this. Sorry, is that right? Yeah, that's right. Is the next one? Yeah, back to you.
Yeah. So the fact that Z-Force socialized with Icelanders more outside their camp, but 162 Squadron within Camp Maple Leaf is a very interesting development. There's obviously some changes there. If put into context with how Icelandic women were covered and judged in the Icelandic media during the war for interacting with the occupying forces, as I mentioned, in relation to the situation, it is not improbable that Icelandic women would have preferred to attend dances at Camp Maple Leaf in 1944, rather than, for example, socializing with soldiers in restaurants or bars where other Icelanders would be. And by attending social events within the camp at that time, Icelandic women could rather escape this harsh judgment of Icelandic society and not have to worry so much about being judged by the community for simply associating themselves with soldiers. So it's not, of course, everybody's attitude, but this was the general societal attitude when it came to the occupying forces, and they were outsiders and not a part of us, I guess, if that makes sense. But parties at Maple Leaf were very frequent, as I mentioned, and Icelanders were almost always invited, usually just women, but sometimes Icelandic men as well. Festive food was often served, and 162 Squadron, for example, they brought a chef with them to the country, which not every squadron did, and they served all kinds of delicacies that were difficult to obtain in Iceland during that time. And a number of parties would be held in the commanding officer's mess, where people would be dressed in their finest attire and have like extravagant meals and there are many photographs from parties at Camp Maple Leaf, which can be found in archival collections in Canada, and they tell us so much. Even like these photographs and just looking at people sitting around, just what they're eating, what they're wearing. It's really interesting. Next slide, please. But yeah, one of the most interesting facts about the presence of 162 Squadron in Iceland is how proportionally many of the airmen were Canadians of Icelandic origin. Many of them were from the Canadian province of Manitoba or Alberta, where many Icelanders settled in the early 20th century. In fact, between 1874 and 1914, around 15 to 20% of all Icelanders emigrated to North or South America. Technically, most of them went to Manitoba or Alberta, but some went to North Dakota, I think, and then some, just like 20 people went to Brazil, which is very random, but that was quite interesting. But the colony of New Iceland was established in 1875 at around Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. So most of the Icelanders settled there, and they created this little community, which still exists to this day. They host an Icelandic festival every year, which is like always the same weekend in the summer. And they've hosted this event since, I think it was like 1892 or something, and they've hosted it every year apart from 2020, which is quite crazy. But yeah, this means that Canada has the largest population of people that claim Icelandic descent outside of Iceland. And yeah, interestingly, there were Canadians of Icelandic descent that participated in both world wars. Some of the Canadians that were stationed in Iceland during the Second World War were of Icelandic heritage and had family ties to Iceland that British and American forces just could not compete with. Some of them spoke Icelandic and were brought in as translators, but others spoke little to no Icelandic at all, but had grown up learning about Iceland and the Icelandic sagas, and obviously had some kind of cultural connection, even though they didn't have the language capabilities. But yeah.
And did the authorities try and make anything of this? Because I'm thinking of examples. For example, I don't know, the Comanche code talkers in the U.S. Army. The press, always try to kind of celebrate these coming together of different cultures and national dress and costumes, things like that. And it was a way to kind of reinforce friendships, because we are talking about essentially an occupying force. I mean, the British and Canadians did not request formal permission to come to Iceland. They just turned up there because it was a strategic location. So there's always the idea of kind of establishing hearts and minds and winning over the population. Say, hey, we've got Icelandic people in our army. Did the press or anyone make anything of this, or was it more of an unknown thing that you and your colleagues have sort of discovered?
So I think the Icelanders that interacted with Canadians at that time viewed them as mostly just similar to the British, but unless they had family ties to Iceland, so the ones that were of Icelandic heritage, they would, for example, like bring their friends with them and meet their like distant relatives in Iceland. Their relatives might also come to parties at Camp Maple Leaf. So there was definitely the Canadian military, I want to say, like really latched onto this connection, and they really wanted to make this, I guess, not a forced connection, but like trying to monetize this connection between Iceland and Canada in this way because of this like shared heritage thing. Okay. So I think the attitude, but this is something we're like not quite sure of, but like wondering about the attitude towards the Canadians and whether that could have been a lot different than between, for example, between Icelanders and the British or American forces. Whether there was a difference in attitude there is quite interesting, and that's something that we're trying to figure out. But there were, I think I want to say at least 3, but possibly 6 airmen in 162 Squadron that were of Icelandic heritage. So this is something that I'm trying to figure out more from like diving into primary sources and stuff like that, and getting into touch with families. And yeah.
Brilliant stuff. So some conclusions and a couple of personal stories, and there's a couple of questions for you. So brilliant stuff. Back to you. Your summary.
Yeah, I guess this is just a conclusion of the difference between Z-Force and 162 Squadron. What was the main difference between their time in Iceland? First of all, there was the funding. Like I mentioned, Z-Force was poorly prepared, ill-equipped, and did not even have comfortable sleeping accommodations while in Iceland. Meanwhile, the airmen of 162 Squadron had quite comfortable accommodations at Camp Maple Leaf, and obviously had much more to do in the form of social activities. The Canadian Air Force had and still has a much more funding than the Canadian Army. And Z-Force soldiers had the most interaction with Icelanders outside their camp, while 162 Squadron invited Icelanders to their parties within the camp, away from prying eyes of the Icelandic society. The incidence of STIs among Z-Force soldiers was considered a problem, while the incidence of STIs among 162 Squadron was very low, which is very interesting, which indicates that men of 162 Squadron had access to contraceptives such as condoms, which became more common, I think, in 1944. Because of the, and also because of the family connections of 162 Squadron, like we were just talking about.
Yeah.
With some of the airmen being of Icelandic descent, I think the Canadians interacted with more Icelanders of a higher social standing that Z-Force did. And because of this, in addition to the large amount of money that 162 Squadron had, Icelanders were more willing to interact with 162 Squadron rather than Z-Force soldiers. And also, if we think about just Z-Force was in the beginning of the occupation, and 162 Squadron's quite at the end of the occupation. There's a gap in between where the Americans take over as the main occupying forces. A lot of things change just in those 4 years. And so there's a question of whether the attitude of Icelanders was just different in 1940 versus 1944 or 45. And that Icelanders had more like relaxed a little bit, and like, or it might be also just that they were more secretive about it and interacted at private events and private parties instead of public events.
Thank you. Next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell one personal story. So I have come into contact with several veterans that were in 162 Squadron. I think so. This was at the beginning of my PhD program. I think sadly passed away shortly after I met him, and I think it was in 2024, summer of 2024, that he passed away. I met this guy in Winnipeg in 2023, and he was turning 100 years old a few days after I met him. Absolutely amazing. Just told me about his experience of being stationed in Iceland, and he mentioned like the Icelandic women are so beautiful, and like we invited them to our parties, and yeah, they came to movie screenings, and yeah, I was like asking him all kinds of fun questions. But when I asked him about just what it was like just flying in an airplane, shooting down submarines and stuff like that, he was just like, he just thought it was so horrible, and he just experienced the Germans as just being young boys like him. He was like 21 years old at that time, so wow. He was absolutely amazing. And there's a street named after him too.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, that's this guy. So that's all for me. Thank you again for having me. If you are of like Icelandic descent and I mentioned your relative or something, please contact me. My email's on slide. That's 20kll@queensu.ca.
It would be great if someone's watching who, and it does happen. It's one of those things I'm really proud of, is when someone who's a family member of someone, because YouTube is basically a Google search with videos, basically. So people just put things in and then find older shows of mine, then make contact. So who knows, it could happen. So fantastic
it has
presentation.
happened. Yeah, I was at the Icelandic Festival, I think, in 2023, and there was some guy, I had a booth, and the guy came up to me and was like, oh yeah, this guy, he's like my uncle or something. Brilliant. And he was like, oh yeah, let's get in touch. And yeah, it's always amazing to make these kind of family connections and hear personal stories. It's probably my favorite part.
We have a few more questions that didn't come up in the show. So when you were talking about the STIs and that kind of thing, and the gradual implementation of condoms and things like that, Veronica, one of our resident nurses, is saying, was penicillin available for Canadians there, or rather more generally, what were the medical facilities like there? I mean, obviously prevention is the best option, but obviously you have to then treat people there. So what were the medical facilities like for the Canadians and perhaps the British and Americans as well? Was there a dedicated military hospital there, for example?
So I think I'm not too sure about that, but if I understand it correctly, I think the occupying forces, if anybody got sick or something, I think they just brought them to the general hospital, and then they had like military doctors that just like had setups there, I think. But there might have been also designated military hospitals, like if they were stationed somewhere out in the country. Regarding penicillin, I have just looked into this like quite briefly when it comes to just the overall use of penicillin when it comes to the war. I think it didn't become like general. I don't think it became like generally accessible for Canadians until, I want to say, 1944.
Yeah, I think it was a bit later in the war. Yeah.
They didn't, yeah, it wasn't until like, I want to say like 43, 44 where it became generally accessible for soldiers and airmen. So I want to say that 162 Squadron would have had some access to penicillin, but not necessarily, because again, it's in Iceland. It's like their rations are limited, at least when it comes to Z4. So this might actually also I guess this wouldn't be a reason why the STI rates would be low, because they would still be there, because there would still be the diagnoses. But yeah, I think it was generally not accessible for Z-Force, but yes, accessible for 162 Squadron.
Thank you. I mean, one of your slides earlier mentioned that at one point there's almost more military people there than there are local men. So that leads us to a question from Sir Capo. Were there fights between the local men and these foreigners there? I mean, there are famously some incidents in the UK between white GIs and black GIs and locals getting involved and things like that. But was there anything in Iceland?
So the Canadians didn't. They mostly behave themselves quite well. There aren't, like, I've looked into police records and stuff like that, and most of the police records that relate to the occupying forces, any assaults or anything like that, it was mostly actually the Americans. So there was some instances when the British were there. Of course, there are a lot more than the Canadians. They're like relatively like 30,000 at most at one time, I think. Not quite sure, but yeah. Sorry, what was the question?
About I forgot what the question was. So yeah, fights, interactions, altercations. Yeah.
So yeah, I think there were like quite frequent. I think bar fights were quite frequent, just between Icelanders and the occupying forces, but not so much the Canadians. There was like one incident where men of Z-Force were suspected of like robbing a store, I think, but that was like the only case where the Canadians were like specifically suspected of something. They didn't do very much, but there were definitely frequent bar fights. I think they had like they implemented a curfew as well for the soldiers, and I think especially when it came to the Americans, because this became a considerable problem. And yeah, I think the Icelandic men viewed the occupying force, or generally speaking, not everyone, but viewed them as competition. I guess.
Right.
If you think like what Icelandic men looked like at the time, you're comparing like a upstanding US soldier in a nice uniform with good manners compared to like a, I don't know, like a guy who's wearing like woolen sweater and kind of, you know, he's kind of smelly.
Someone being different can often be attractive. It's if
Exactly.
different to what you know. It's not that they're better. It's just that they're different. You know, I knew a young guy, a Cuban American living in Florida, who looked like everybody else in Florida. But when he studied in Norway, he suddenly became the exotic one, like Antonio Banderas, or that kind of thing, turning up, and so he was suddenly very, very popular. But back in Florida, he just is the same as everybody else. So I think, yeah, if you're an Icelandic woman and you're seeing someone different to the type of men you normally meet, it just seems different, I suppose. So, yeah, brilliant. Thanks.
That was really exciting, and like I feel like the younger generation was more like curious, but the older generation more wary and kind of like, oh, what are you doing here? You know.
Yeah. Thank you.
There's a generational difference as well, I think.
Yeah. So, we have two questions about the economy, because you mentioned at the beginning about it being considered one of the poorest countries in Europe. So, Ian said, did the Icelandic standard of living increase significantly during the war years? And Gunnar in the Netherlands said, you mentioned that it was one of the poorest countries due to the occupation of Canada and the US, Britain. Has this changed anything? I mean, you mentioned that 1944 was an important year kind of politically for Iceland. So, did the economy change? Did things get better? And if so, what particular reason was behind it?
Goodness, I guess one of the main reasons is Iceland was one of the, or just I think it was the only country who didn't particularly participate in the war directly, but still received the Marshall Aid.
Right.
Which means like there was just money thrown into everything, and just the US influence as well. Just once the US took over as main occupying forces, the Icelandic government just worked very closely with the US, and I think they were, at least one of the reasons why we gained independence in 1944 was because of the US occupation, but also, I guess, because Denmark was occupied. And
yeah, a good time to kind of break free from the family, you know, like you've got your own troubles. We've got a little bit of money behind us now. We've been recognized. Time to kind of part there. And we had another question, which would be, basically, we'll invite you back in the future for a further show. But Caswayne asked about the how did the American influence differ to that the Canadians? I mean, you've already kind of partially answered it by the fact that the American presence is much more substantial. So larger people, so more permanent camps, more infrastructure, more resources than the British and Canadians, who, as you've been explaining, were kind of getting by with limited resources. So I'm assuming the Americans just came with more of everything, and it was in some ways easier, a bigger and larger setup. Is that the main difference?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're talking about like also the difference between the British and the US occupation, like what changes there, the British are just like, they're worried, they need their soldiers, they need their men elsewhere because of what is happening on mainland Europe at that time. And the US is kind of like just entering the war and has just so many resources and just so much funding and everything. And yeah, when they agreed to take over as the main occupying force, they hadn't really entered the war officially. It was like a little bit
Right.
later
in
that summer, I think. So they officially agreed to take over Iceland before they officially entered the war. But yeah, there's just so much changes. I mentioned urbanization, for example. Icelandic population was mostly just spread over like small towns and stuff like that. But when the occupation began, like with the British, just people start to gather in Reykjavik, and this like escalates even more when the US shows up, because they just so many jobs become available, and it's like quite common just for Icelanders to work for the British or like the American occupying forces, just doing construction work or just anything really. It created so many jobs. So, but it also made us quite close with the US, and this like it created this kind of bond that we haven't been able to, I guess, reverse. Yeah.
And you mentioned about obviously the fact there's loads of Canadians, Brits, and Americans. And I asked you before you went live about learning English as you did at school there. But Jim is saying prior to World War II, how much English did your average Icelandic family speak? I mean, obviously now tourism is a big thing, and people come from all over the world to Iceland, and that's a major part of your economy then. But I'm assuming that with 5 years plus of troops who predominantly speak English there, it really increased the English levels.
Yeah, definitely. So before the occupation, I want to say like not very many Icelanders spoke English. If they did, then it was just like a few words or a few phrases or something like that. And that continued mostly throughout the beginning of the occupation. But as it went on, I think a lot more people learned just Icelandic just by proximity or like by working. They would like, if they're working at bars or restaurants or stuff like that, they would serve the occupying forces. But the occupying forces would also try and learn some Icelandic, like they called the women, they called them stúlkas, like they would call after them on the street and try and say something in Icelandic, which would often like not be very well understood. Where was I going with this? Yeah.
Okay. And my last question, thank you very much. My last question is, I always like to sort of ask people from different nationalities this is I know you're in Canada right now and have been there for a few years, but how, beyond Iceland's specific role in World War II, how significant is the Second World War to the people of Iceland today in 2026? Because speaking as a Brit, the cliche of the British middle-aged man who has models of tanks on his shelf and goes to place the events like the We Have Ways Festival in September this year and watching documentaries, watching war films. Does Iceland have that? Is it something that Icelandic people kind of grow up watching war films and reading about it, or is it been more of an abstract thing to the people of Iceland?
I think we experience it in a different way because we were like kind of firstly forced into it, but then also we don't have a military. So that's quite interesting, like for me to study military history, but being from a country that doesn't have a military. So it's like I view myself as a more like cultural historian that studies people during wartime. And that's really what I guess Icelandic history is when it comes to the Second World War. There are just so many societal changes. Again, there's just so much that happens that leads to changes in Icelandic society. And just, it was quite like catapulted in modernity. Like it just, there's so obvious differences just between 39 and then 46 or 45.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, you mentioned Ava Brown there going there in 1939 and Himmler taking interest. I mean, Iceland's history could have gone down a very different fork, possibly in 1939, 40. And it went down this particular fork because of circumstances, because of Britain's, as you said, kind of hastily, we better put some people there. And then the Canadians, we better hastily put some more people there. And it ended up taking a path that it's still sort of on now. And, most people now would have some mental image of Iceland because of, we've seen the tourism documentaries, we've seen all those colors and the skies and that kind of thing. So I'm fascinated. I talked to you before going live about how each country's vision of the war there's a shared image of the war that all countries sort of buy into, but then there's the unique perspective of each country because of its own particular location and its role in the war. So France has a slightly different attitude to the war to Belgium, to the Netherlands. Norway is different to Denmark, different to Sweden, different to Finland, different to Greenland, different to Iceland. And I think that's why I'm glad you came to give us that uniquely Icelandic slant, because it's stuff we wouldn't get any elsewhere. So my last question, I know I said about the last, but last question is for you specifically. You said, cultural historian. Do you see the war being part of your future work, or are you going to be going off in different directions? What's the future hold for you, if it's not too much of a question?
So I guess I would say I specialize in just like 20th century Icelandic-Canadian cultural history. So I would love to explore what happens like to Iceland's and Canada's relationship after the war. So that is something I wanna look into, because I've been working on this topic for about 6 years now, because I did the same topic in my master's. So I'm really looking forward to just explore what happens after that, really, and like dive into Icelandic foreign affairs and in relationship to Canada, because that's quite relevant today, with Canada having a large settlement or large population of people of Icelandic heritage. So there, I think it was just last year, the year before that, where the Icelandic president visited Canada for the first time in like 100 years or something.
Wow.
So there is definitely, they're trying to establish a closer relationship with Canada and with everything that's happening in the US. I think that is something that Iceland wants to do and move closer to Europe and to Canada.
Well, Europe needs some stable countries coming in and steadying the ship right now, because anyway, we don't want to go to the modern politics, but yeah, the world needs good people. So it's been fantastic talking to you. Folks, I'm off for 2 days because I'm going off doing some stuff in Paris, and I've got a show with Roman is coming on. So a Frenchman's talking about US Marine Corps tanks on terror, and then I'm afraid I'm taking a few days off because I'm going to go back to England to see my dad, who's not doing very well. Then we're back in April with lots of stuff coming your way. We got War Crimes weeks. We got shows about the Green Howards in Sicily, lots of stuff. Just keep checking the schedules. And as always, click like and subscribe. But thank you very much. It's been great talking to you. And folks, thank you for your fantastic questions. See you next time, everybody. Bye. Bye.